The obsession with the forgotten hospital. My girlfriend and I are passionate about road trips, but things wouldn't have taken a turn for the worse if our passion had stayed within its limits. On a rainy day, Stella and I were on our way back from a road trip. The rain grew heavier, and driving became challenging amidst the storm, so we decided to pull over on the highway shoulder. I worried that waiting on the highway during a storm wasn't a safe choice. I was pondering what to do next when Stella said,
"Look, Mark."
"There's a building at the left, turn up ahead." I followed her gaze and saw a structure peeking out from behind the trees at some distance. Stella said,
"Let's go there. We might find shelter for the night."
At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I realized it was an abandoned hospital. We got out of the car and ran inside. The large glass door at the entrance was shattered. As we stepped into the hospital, I realized no one had been here in ages. Furniture was broken, and shards of glass were scattered everywhere. Rain seeped through the damp ceiling and dripped onto the floor. The sound of water droplets mixed with the creak of rust. The wind howled through broken windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. Stella whispered, "This feels like an adventure." Stella was a horror writer, so an eerie setting like this excited her. We'd explored many abandoned places for her creative inspiration. I chuckled and said, "Let's look around. Who knows, you might find a story here." If I'd known my joke would turn into a nightmare, I would have left right then. Stella and I began exploring the place, turning on our phone flashlights. To the left was a hallway, lined with several rooms. We entered the hallway and opened the first room. Inside was an old, dirty bed. Near the bed were a table and a chair. What caught my attention was the safety straps attached to the bed handles. I'd never seen hospital beds this strange before. Most of the rooms were like this. After a while, Stella grew bored and said there was nothing to see here and suggested going upstairs. We climbed the stairs, cobwebs and dust everywhere. The hallway upstairs was littered with broken glass and damp clothes scattered everywhere. When I shone my flashlight on the walls, I saw disturbing drawings, demonic faces etched onto the walls. Someone had even written, "You will not escape." I felt uneasy seeing all this and told Stella, "Maybe we should wait in the car. The rain will stop eventually." Stella teased and mocked me. At the end of the hallway, there was a large door with the words "Surgery Department" on it. Stella was looking at the graffiti on the wall. I asked her, "What do you think happened here?" Stella smiled and said it was just a surgery room. I pushed the door open with annoyance, and with a terrible creaking sound, it opened. I've never seen such a strange operating table before. It looked more like a stretcher, but it had handcuffs and leather straps. Stella's face went pale as she examined all of it with a genuinely terrified expression. I approached the operating table. There were surgical tools lying on it. These tools looked quite different. Scalpels resembled small saws, and there was also a drill. I picked it up and examined it. I told Stella and wondered aloud what this tool was used for. Stella looked at it with frightened eyes and said she didn't think this was a normal hospital. She explained it used to be an asylum. That's why there were leather straps and handcuffs on all the beds in the rooms. Before I could process it, my eyes were drawn to the tip of the drill in my hand. Something dark was dried and speckled on its edge. I shone the light on it and was horrified to realize it looked like dried blood. There was something like a freezer. Stella rushed over and opened it. She started screaming. A horrifying sight lay before us. Inside were numerous jars, emitting a foul stench. They contained ears, noses, and other unidentifiable parts. We couldn't believe our eyes that patients were treated in such grotesque ways. Then I saw one jar. It resembled a model of a human head with its eyes closed. But what happened next still chills me to this day. As we stared at it, it suddenly opened its eyes. We stumbled back, terrified, and began running for our lives. When I looked back, I saw a dark figure chasing us. Sprinting forward, we could hear the screams of hundreds of voices emanating from the asylum, crying out in agony. Stella and I bolted out of the asylum and jumped into the car. Without a second thought, I slammed the gas pedal so hard the car screeched. Somehow, we were lucky to have survived. Stella later researched the abandoned asylum. She discovered that it once housed insane criminals and intellectually disabled individuals, but the doctors running it would often torture them and conduct inhumane experiments on them. After a series of protests, the asylum was shut down, and all records were erased. Locals feared the place, even during the day. They believed the countless souls of the tormented patients still haunted the site. Horror menu at fast food store. Alex was working the third shift at a local Wendy's to pay for his tuition. The job was nothing special, just the occasional late-night customer, making things a little more interesting. That night, he spent most of his shift sweeping and wiping down counters. Just as he thought he was going to die of boredom, a car pulled up to the drive-through speaker. Alex set down his rag, put on his headset, and said,
"Welcome to Wendy's. What can I get for you?"
The car pulled up to the pickup window, and the order was unusually large, 50 chicken nuggets and 10 double cheeseburgers. Alex entered the order into the computer, feeling sorry for his coworker, Brad, who was the only cook on shift. Brad would have to make all of that food by himself. Alex asked if he wanted anything else, but the man remained silent and simply drove up to the window. A pickup truck. The man's vehicle was white, coated in a thick layer of grime on the windshield and windows, with patches of rust and dents. As the driver's window rolled down, Alex finally saw him. The man was unsettling. He had pale, sunken eyes with dark purple circles underneath. He was sweating and looked restless. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Strange scars ran down his arms, as if something had gnawed on his limbs. Alex tried not to stare and opened the window. A horrific stench wafted out from the truck, a smell like a rotting swamp. The man said nothing. He simply handed Alex a crumpled $50 bill. Alex took the money, trying to remain calm despite the man's scarred arms and the truck's overwhelming stench. One thing Alex had learned working in fast food was to avoid conflict at all costs. He handed the man his change and directed him to the designated waiting spot for large orders. Alex told him he'd bring the food out when it was ready, but the man just stared at him with those hollow eyes. Then, the man muttered something repeatedly. "Sandy is so hungry." Alex quickly told him the food would be ready soon and shut the window. But the man didn't move. He didn't park where Alex had directed him. Alex waited for Brad to start passing the food through the window. But after 5 minutes, Brad had only prepared 20 nuggets and 2 burgers. After a few minutes of waiting, he started knocking on the window, demanding his food. When Alex opened the window to check, the man insisted, "Sandy won't wait any longer." Alex could only nod, promising to hurry before quickly shutting the window. Less than 2 minutes passed before he knocked again. This time, he reached out, grabbed Alex by the collar, and snarled, "Sandy won't wait anymore. Do you want me to feed you to her?" Panicked, Alex shoved him away and demanded he leave. The man growled, jumped into his truck, and sped off into the night. About half an hour passed with no customers, so Alex and Brad sat in the kitchen, chatting. Suddenly, in the middle of their conversation, the power in the store cut out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Alex and Brad froze, turning toward the noise. He had come back. He stood at the window, no longer in his truck. this time clutching a large sack against his chest. His pale lips curled into a sickening smile. Then, to Alex's horror, he pushed open the window.
Sandy needs to eat.
Brad lunged toward the window in rage. The man opened the sack and dumped its contents into the store. Something heavy and wet hit the floor with a sickening sound. Alex squinted, trying to make sense of it. The horrific sound sent chills down Alex's spine. He pulled his phone from his pocket and turned on the flashlight. What he saw would haunt him forever. It was an alligator. It lunged forward and clamped its jaws around Brad's ankle. Brad screamed in agony. The lunatic at the window giggled. "Sandy's hungry. Sandy's hungry," he repeated over and over. Alex grabbed a cast iron pan and swung it with all his strength at the alligator. It screeched and backed off for a moment. In a frenzy, Alex yanked Brad into the kitchen and slammed the door shut behind them. He dialed 911 as they waited in terror, the sound of claws scraping against the floor and the lunatic's distorted mumblings echoing outside. After 10 agonizing minutes, the police arrived and arrested the man. Yet he still wore that deranged, inexplicable grin. Animal control arrived a few minutes later, sedated the alligator, and transported it to a wildlife sanctuary. The Curse of the Red Shirt Girl. Arthur was driving home from a friend's birthday party on a quiet night. The streets were empty. The only sound was the wind whistling through the deserted roads. As he drove, he noticed a young girl standing alone by the roadside. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and wore a striking red coat over a white dress. To him, she looked beautiful, but as his car approached, she raised her hand, signaling for a ride. Arthur slowly pulled over and rolled down his window as she approached the car. The girl asked Arthur,
"Sir, if you don't mind, may I have a ride?"
He didn't think much of it and immediately agreed. She sat in the back seat. Feeling a little nervous, Arthur hesitantly asked her where she lived. She didn't say a word but handed him a small note. The address was written in faded ink, as if scribbled down years ago.
All right, what's your name?
Her lips barely moved as she whispered.
Mary Tellish.
A strange feeling crept over him. Something about her name seemed familiar, like a whisper from the past. Her expression never changed. He tried to ease the tension by asking about her interests. Her voice was flat.
I used to play with dolls when I was little, but I can't play with them anymore.
She smiled gently, but not in a normal way. It was unsettling, filled with sorrow.
They took them away from me.
Something about the way she spoke sent chills down Arthur's spine. They were nearing an old cemetery, its rusted iron gates glowing under the moonlight. Suddenly, Mary leaned forward. Mary asked him to stop at the cemetery gate. She placed her icy hand on his shoulder.
Please, take my coat and return it to my home as soon as possible.
For a brief moment, he swore her fingers didn't actually touch him. It was a strange, ghostly sensation. Before he could respond, she darted out of the car, heading toward the cemetery gates, leaving her red coat behind. The next day, Arthur arrived at the address. It was a large wooden house, located far in the quiet outskirts. He knocked on the door and was greeted by an elderly woman. He asked her about the woman he had met.
Ma'am, does Mary Tailish live here?
But then something unexpected happened. The woman suddenly burst into tears and invited him inside. The house was large and beautifully decorated inside. He noticed pictures of Mary. In every single one, she was wearing the same red coat. The woman began telling him about Mary. She was their daughter. One night, while she was on her way home, a group of men kidnapped her and took her away. The mother had been worried sick. 2 days later, the police found Mary's body. Her eyes and left arm were missing. Arthur was speechless. He had seen her eyes, her hands, her beating heart when she sat in his car. But in reality, Mary Tailish had been dead for years. Trying to remain calm, he handed them her coat, then left. As soon as he got into his car, he saw Mary again. But this time, she wasn't the same. She was no longer human. Her red coat still clung to her shoulders, but now it was tattered and soaked in something dark. Her eyes were hollow, her skin ashen, and she gave him a chilling smile before vanishing. Arthur tried to push it all out of his mind, but for days, he kept seeing Mary in every shadow, every reflection in the window. One night, he woke up in bed and saw her standing in the corner of his room. Her left hand was missing, a dark stain on her chest where something had been taken. She whispered,
Arthur, you helped me.
Her freezing fingers touched his forehead. Suddenly, sharp pain, screams, and the sound of something being cut open filled his mind. He saw dark figures, their shadows stretching over a struggling girl. He felt her terror. Then he saw their faces, their eyes, staring directly at him. Then darkness. Arthur woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and decided to go to the police station. He thought they'd laugh at him, but instead, they pulled out old case files. It was all real, but they had never found the suspects. The news became a major headline. Arthur had, in some way, helped bring justice for Mary Tailish. There was a legend Arthur later found online. Anyone who meets Mary Tailish must help her, or they will meet a terrible fate. Luckily, Arthur had been kind to her. Haunting delivery trip. Lena was working for a food delivery platform on the weekends to earn extra money, juggling between her main job and side gig. It was past 9 p.m., with a light drizzle in the air. Lena started her shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After completing her first delivery, 20 minutes passed with no new orders. Then her phone rang with a new request. After picking up the order, Lena started driving. It was a quiet neighborhood, nothing unusual. As she approached a red light, she noticed a pickup truck pulling up beside her. Instinctively, she glanced over. The driver was leaning out of his window, staring directly at her car. When the light turned green, Lena stepped on the gas. She glanced in the rearview mirror. The pickup truck was now following at a distance. Lena tried to stay calm, but as she turned into the neighborhood, the pickup truck turned in as well. She thought maybe he lived there. Following the GPS, she arrived at the final street, but confusingly, it was a dead end. Lena hit the brakes, pulling over near the house she was supposed to deliver to. The pickup truck followed and parked right behind her. Lena sat there, trying to come up with a plan in case things took a bad turn. She wondered, what was this guy doing? Was he really following her? Lena glanced at her phone and saw a message from the customer. When will the food arrive? Could it be? Was he the customer? Lena felt trapped and helpless. Then, he stepped out of the truck, slowly approaching Lena's car. He stopped near the trunk, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Suddenly, he picked up a metal rod, and smashed it against her rear windshield, shattering the glass. Instinctively, she slammed on the gas. He leaped onto the back of her car, trying to crawl through the shattered window. Lena swerved sharply, throwing him off the car. She sped away, hands trembling as she grabbed her phone to call the police. But he wasn't going to let her escape that easily. The pickup truck was right behind her again, its headlights shining blindingly into her rearview mirror, making Lena squint. Suddenly, the truck lunged forward, ramming into the back of her car. The impact made Lena swerve, pain shooting through her ribs. Lena pressed the gas pedal hard, but the rain had made the road slick. She had to maintain control to avoid a crash. Panic flooded her as he pulled up alongside her, rolled down his window, and grinned a twisted, eerie smile. Then, another hit. The back of her car crumpled, and she felt something warm trickling down. Her forehead, her head had been injured in the collision. Dazed, Lena slammed on the brakes. With no other choice, she grabbed her phone again and called 911 for help. Through the rain, she could see his silhouette stepping out of the truck. Desperate, Lena floored the gas pedal and drove blindly. But moments later, her car slammed into a tree. She fumbled for the door handle, struggling to get out before he reached her. From a distance, she could hear him screaming in frustration. Despite the pain, she forced herself to run, sprinting toward the forest at the roadside. Lena tripped. Her ankle twisted, sending pain shooting up her leg, rendering her unable to move. He was almost on top of her as she desperately tried to crawl toward the roadside. Lena turned to face him. He raised a crowbar, and she screamed, thinking this was the end. But then, police sirens pierced through the quiet rain. He froze, ready to flee, but it was too late. The police fired a taser, bringing him down. At last, he was caught. Lena's vision blurred as she slipped into unconsciousness. Paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Relief flooded over her. The nightmare was finally over. The mysterious house in the deep forest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fireplace. Nick sat in the chair, lost in thought. He remembered what he had gone through and seemed unable to escape that feeling. In the late 80s, Nick and his friend Ken, both experienced hikers, decided to take a different route from their usual long-distance trails. They passed through the woods behind the farm, intrigued by a nearby ranch that raised exotic animals like cassowaries, strange and out of place in the countryside. They ventured deeper into the forest, the trees becoming denser as they moved further from familiar grounds. The air was filled with a damp smell as they pushed through thick underbrush, their excitement gradually building. As they continued walking, they strayed off the path and came upon an old, dilapidated house neither of them had seen before. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Just looking at the house gave Nick an ominous feeling, but they couldn't resist their purpose, to explore, so they naturally decided to go inside and check it out. Inside, the house had a very classic style, probably built in the late 40s or early 50s. But Ken saw and witnessed something even more terrifying. There were writings and symbols in strange, Latin-like languages about a worship ritual believed to be satanic or pagan. Some of the images depicted how to sacrifice human souls to an entity believed to be demonic, leaving them in disbelief. Ken exclaimed, as it was the first time he'd seen anything like it. To this day, and even at that moment, Nick still insists that some of the symbols painted on the walls were not merely red paint. The kitchen was cramped, and there was a narrow staircase leading upstairs. It was so tight that their shoulders would brush against the walls as they ascended. As they climbed the stairs, Nick felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He glanced back, but saw only Ken behind him. Ken stopped midway, frozen in place, insisting that he had seen a shadow dart across the stairs above. Nick forced a smile to reassure him, even though he too felt something was off. Their fear seemed to be increasingly palpable. The upstairs was pitch dark, with a room at the end of a narrow hallway. Leading to it were strange, dried red streaks that looked like blood seeping into the floor. As soon as they entered the room, they were confronted with many similar strange symbols. What caught their attention was the sight of chains with handcuffs hanging from the walls, as if someone had tried to lock something or someone in this very room. Then, the faint sound of chains clinking filled the room. The chains hanging on the walls began to sway, as if moved by an unseen force, despite the windows being tightly shut and no breeze present. Suddenly, they heard a noise, footsteps approaching from behind, resembling the sound of heels tapping on wood, quickly ascending the stairs behind them. Terrified, they ran down the stairs, but found no one there. The house fell silent once again, except for their labored breathing. There were no new footprints, only the ones they had left when they entered. Too frightened to stay, they decided to leave the house. But no matter which direction they took or how they used the compass, they tried it more than 10 times that night, walking from every possible route or direction. Yet, they always ended up standing in front of the house's main door. They tried again and again, walking in every conceivable direction, but the result was always the same. Caught in a disorienting and seemingly hopeless loop, they became utterly exhausted and terrified. Standing before the house one final time, they were met with something far worse. At that moment, Kin nearly fainted before looking up and pointing to the front-facing window on the second floor of the house. Nick and Kin crouched, frozen in fear. There it was, a figure. Yes, they both saw it. A tall, shadowy woman stood at the window, staring at them. Though they couldn't discern her facial features, her large, dark eyes were unmistakable. Then, she vanished instantly. Overcome with terror, they ran as fast as they could through the forest, eventually stopping at the edge of a federal road about 3 miles from the house. To this day, they still don't know how they managed to find their way back. It felt like a miracle. 5 years later, Nick and Kin decided to return to the house. But this time, when they arrived, the house had completely collapsed, leaving only rubble and debris. Nick later stumbled upon an online article about the house. Don was a man with unusual behavior. He had locked his mother in the attic and abused her for years, then used the house for his own sinister purposes. The weight of the truth slowly sank into Nick as he learned about the story and the dark history behind it. Now looking back, Nick realized that some things are better left buried, and some houses should never be revisited. The Hitchhiker's Trap. This happened in the winter of 1993, when Keely was 20 years old. It was 1:30 May, when Keely finished her shift at the factory and stopped at a gas station to fill up her smoking car. The gas station was nearly empty, except for a few cars parked in the distance. While Keely was pumping gas, a woman began approaching. She appeared to be around Keely's age, approaching with a frightened, distressed, and anxious look. The woman spoke hurriedly, out of breath. She said she had argued with her boyfriend and needed to use a payphone to call a friend for a ride. Keely listened, but her unease grew as the woman explained that she had been harassed and feared the men in a light green car parked next to the gas station's dumpster. Initially hesitant, Keely noted that the woman was dressed neatly and wasn't drunk or anything similar. She just seemed genuinely anxious and scared. So, after finishing her refueling, Keely told her to get in the car. As they drove down a dark, quiet street, Keely asked where the woman lived. The woman kept glancing into the rearview mirror, fidgeting in her seat. She didn't answer Keely's question, just mumbled something incomprehensible. Then she asked Keely to take her to a house not far away on the edge of town. When they arrived, it looked unusual, almost abandoned. Keely asked skeptically, "You live here?" She simply told Keely the house was under renovation and asked her to wait outside for a moment. Keely reluctantly got out of the car and leaned on the hood. She called back, asking Keely to help her. Still trying to make sense of everything, Keely reluctantly agreed and approached the porch. However, as Keely neared the house, a sense of hesitation crept over her. Something about this house, and the woman felt off. Just as she reached out to touch the doorknob, a loud bang erupted behind her. Time seemed to freeze, and she felt a sharp pain at the back of her head. Everything spun as the pain surged, and the next thing she knew, she was collapsing onto the ground in front of the porch. Keely's vision blurred, but she could still see the woman standing over her with a smug smile. "Thanks for the help," she said, as darkness consumed Keely, punctuated by her chilling laughter. When Keely woke up, her wrists and ankles were tightly bound with rope. Her head throbbed with pain as she lay on the floor of a dark, filthy room reeking of mildew. Keely didn't dare move, but observed what was happening. The woman sat on a chair not far away, holding up her phone on a video call. "You should mind your own business," she said, not even glancing at Keely. Keely regained her vision and focused on the phone screen. It was a man standing next to a car, the same one she had seen at the gas station. He said he'd pick her up soon to catch more victims. She realized everything from the start had been a trap. Keely struggled against her restraints, her mind racing. She knew she had to act fast. Despite the pain, Keely, being the only woman at the plastic factory, had learned to handle such situations. She relied on her experience to quietly inspect and work on her restraints. Finally, the rope loosened slightly, but the woman began approaching Keely, so she decided to stay still, pretending nothing was amiss. When the woman seemed to sense something, she moved closer to Keely. The moment arrived, Keely sprang up, elbowing her in the face. She turned and kicked the woman hard with her bound feet, causing her to stumble painfully to the ground. That gave Keely the chance to free her legs and run outside. Keely dashed outside and got into her car. As she frantically started the engine, the woman suddenly appeared with a menacing smile. Somehow, she had gotten into Keely's car. "Mind giving me a ride?" Just as the car started, the woman, not wearing her seatbelt, was thrown forward as Keely hit the accelerator. Keely pushed the woman out of the car and drove off, calling the police to have them arrested. When Keely finally got home, she told her sister about the harrowing encounter. While relieved that Keely was safe, her sister scolded her for not going to the police immediately. After a few days of investigation, the police arrested the two criminals. Keely couldn't believe what had happened, but at least she had survived. And she learned a terrifying lesson about the hidden dangers in seemingly harmless situations. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C, Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. The police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. The crazy man blocked the truck. It was a torrential, rainy day. After finishing a long, exhausting day at work, I drove my old, large truck back home. The windshield wipers battled against the pouring rain, moving in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, almost drowned out by the sound of rain pounding on the truck's metal body. The road ahead was nearly deserted, a winding path through a remote forest. Tall, ominous trees loomed on both sides, their branches reaching out like twisted, skeletal hands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from the cold. My eyes were focused on the road, but my gaze was weary, longing to be home soon. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. Finding it strange, I drove a short distance further and then pulled over to the side of the road to rest for a moment. From a distance, there was that figure again. The silhouette was of a man, his hair disheveled and soaked by the rain. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to one side, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His clothes were tattered and drenched, clinging to his gaunt frame. In his hand, he held something long, thin, and menacing under the headlights. My heart raced as I stared at the man, an instinctual sense of danger warning me. The man did not move, did not blink, just stood there, staring. My breath fogged up the window as I pondered what to do, making his already ominous figure appear even more distorted and terrifying. But before I could act, the man suddenly lunged forward, slamming his hand on the hood of the truck. The force of the impact made me jump out of my seat, my heart pounding. The man's face was now just inches from the windshield. His eyes were wild and bloodshot. I recoiled in horror as I realized the object in his hand was a long, sharp needle attached to a syringe filled with a murky yellow liquid. The man's mouth curled into a deranged smile, revealing yellowed and cracked teeth. He lifted the needle, tapping it lightly with his finger as if preparing to use it. He fumbled with the door lock, as if deliberately trying to frighten me. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, darkening the scene with a rising sense of dread. The man moved with terrifying speed. He lunged at the side door, yanking it open with astonishing strength. I could barely think, and there was no time to react before the man lunged at me. The syringe was raised, aimed straight at my neck. I struggled, adrenaline surging through my veins as I tried to push the man away. But his grip was like iron, his strength fueled by madness. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man? What did he want? Why was he doing this? The questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers, only a desperate need to survive. The man giggled, a high-pitched, maniacal sound. The needle inched closer. I twisted and turned, trying to evade it, but the man was relentless. In one final desperate move, I surged with a burst of life. I managed to grab the man's wrist. We wrestled, fighting for control. The man's eyes were wide and wild. His foul breath hit my face in a horrific gust. With gritted teeth, I mustered all my remaining strength and shoved the man back with a powerful force, sending him tumbling backward. The syringe fell to the ground, the needle shattering upon impact, the liquid inside spilling out and mixing with the rain. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily, tense with fear. I watched as the man staggered to his feet. He let out a frustrated scream, his voice echoing through the empty forest. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I quickly shifted the truck into gear and hit the gas, the truck speeding away from the deranged man. Exhausted and shaken from the struggle, I drove in silence, quickly contacting the police about the incident and heading straight to the hospital. The man's wild eyes, his maniacal grin, the syringe filled with that strange liquid, they all haunted my mind. After the police investigated, they finally apprehended him and placed him in custody for psychiatric treatment. It turned out he wasn't just targeting me. He was after others as well, all as part of the twisted pleasure of a deranged mind. The Haunting of the Abandoned Station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The ghosts in the fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me, it felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first. Metallic, but quickly turning into a stench, sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. Darkness in the underground subway. My name is Danny, and I'm 22 years old. This is the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, but I don't own a car, so my main mode of transport is the subway. It was a Saturday night, and I was on my way home after a midnight party. I had done this nearly every weekend, so I was used to riding the subway alone at such hours. As I descended the stairs into the tunnel, a chilling atmosphere enveloped me. The station was eerily empty, the silence heightening my senses. I could almost feel eyes on me, a prickling sensation making my heart race. Occasional clanging echoed from an unseen spot, adding to my unease. I arrived early for the train, so I sat on a long bench waiting, trying to shake off the shivers. Just then, I heard a voice, low and gravelly, cutting through the silence. "I'm here, buddy." I looked up and froze. Standing on the tracks in the tunnel was a scruffy man, probably in his 40s. He smiled at me, a creepy grin with at least 3 missing teeth. I started to feel anxious and unsettled. I tried to look away, focusing on my phone, but the man wouldn't leave. Then, suddenly, the man emerged from the darkness, poking his head out of the tunnel, wearing that unsettling grin like the first man. "Come play with us," he called, his voice slurring as if he were drunk. The way they stared at me was unsettling, their eyes locked onto mine as if trying to pull me into some terrible mystery. I kept trying to ignore them, my heart racing with anxiety as I waited for the train. But my gaze caught the man moving deeper into the tunnel. Suddenly, moments later, he turned back, pulling out a syringe, brandishing it menacingly towards me. The gleaming tip caught the dim light of the station, and I felt myself plummeting into terror. He began to taunt, his voice dripping with malice. I could see the madness in his eyes, a kind of insanity. Panic surged within me, and I realized I needed to act fast. Instinct kicked in, and I scanned the area for an escape route. I yelled for him to stay away, my voice barely cutting through the tension in the air. The man stepped closer, his eyes wild and unblinking. "Now you're in my territory, kid." My breath quickened as the train was still a few minutes away. His cackling laughter sent chills down my spine. I glanced at the approaching train's headlights, hope swelling within me, but the man raised the syringe higher, waving it before me mockingly, threateningly. He pointed back toward the tunnel, as if inviting me into a nightmare I didn't want to step into. "You think that train can save you?" Panic churned within me. I scanned the area, realizing I needed to create some distance. In a split-second decision, I lunged to the right, grabbing a metal bar leaning against the corner of the wall. The man lunged at me, and in that moment, I swung the metal bar with all my might. It struck his shoulder, causing him to stagger back. I could see the rage in his eyes as he steadied himself, but the syringe was still raised as he growled, "You will regret this," and charged at me again. This time, I ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding the needle. I thought it best to evade this danger and ran towards the edge of the platform, desperately hoping the train would arrive soon. I decided I had to run. Just as I turned to dash toward the edge of the platform, the man lunged at me, but I was faster. I sprinted toward the train, my heart racing as I jumped aboard just as it came to a stop. I stumbled into the first car, panting heavily. I turned to see the conductor staring at me, concern etched on his face. "There's a man down there. He has a syringe," I yelled, fear and urgency spilling from my lips. The conductor quickly dialed for help, his expression shifting from worry to panic as he listened to me. I felt my heart race as the train began to move, pulling me away from the nightmare behind. When we reached the stop, I jumped off the train and hurried up to the street. I glanced back at the platform one last time, hoping he was gone. Since that night, I've avoided the subway at all costs. I even attended a party at a friend's house. opting to walk a long distance to the next station rather than risk going to that terrifying place again. As I replayed the events in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was dealing with more than just a madman that night. The encounter left me paranoid, my mind racing with hypotheticals. What if he followed me home? What if he was still out there, waiting for his next victim? Each late-night trip became a new test of my courage. In the silence of my apartment, I knew I would never fully escape the memories of that night. One night, weeks later, I passed that very subway station. As I approached the entrance, a figure stepped out from the shadows, a tall, menacing shape holding something in its hand. But then, I realized it wasn't him. It was just a weary man collecting trash from the platform. I tried to rein in my fear until I spotted him on the wanted poster on the subway station bulletin board, the very same conductor who had helped me call for help as I escaped his pursuit. I realized that sometimes the greatest fear isn't the threat itself, but the unpredictable nature of people. You never know who might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. I always believed that evil would be punished by the law, and I would always need to stay vigilant because the line between safety and danger is very thin in this world. Reflection in the mirror. This happened when Mocha was in high school. Her school was an old building, with some parts nearly falling apart. The school had 3 main restrooms that were well maintained, but the last one was different. It was isolated from the other buildings. The floor was always filthy, and out of 6 stalls, only 3 had doors, which were barely functional. One day, Mocha found herself in a desperate situation, needing to use the restroom in the middle of class. Unfortunately, the closest option was that disgusting restroom. Since it was the nearest and she didn't want to test her luck holding it in, she had no choice but to go inside. She rushed toward the old restroom. As soon as she stepped inside, a horrible stench filled her nose, the most disgusting smell she had ever encountered. Mocha hurried into the last stall, which was much cleaner than the others, and tried her best to avoid touching the filthy floor. Afterward, Mocha went to the sink to wash her hands. The restroom was eerily silent, with only the sound of running water. Just then, she heard a faint knocking. Confused, she slowly turned off the faucet. Silence. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things, until the sound came again. She glanced at the mirror, but couldn't see anything. The surface was covered in grime. So Mocha grabbed a tissue and began wiping the mirror. Through the fading haze, she saw something moving, and then she finally saw it. Something pale, something bony. She didn't want to believe her eyes, but there it was, a hand reaching out from one of the stalls, tapping on the door. However, when Mocha quickly turned around, the fingers had vanished. Her heart pounded, but she convinced herself it was just her imagination. But that was when the nightmare began. When Mocha looked into the mirror, she was horrified, unable to believe what she was seeing. In the mirror, her reflection was smiling back at her. But it wasn't just an ordinary smile, it was distorted, grotesque. Mocha's real face was frozen in fear, lips pressed tight, but in the mirror that was not her. And then, Mocha heard the knocking again. To her horror, she saw her reflection knocking on the mirror, trying to grab her attention, beckoning her with the other hand. It whispered, a faint sound, as if it was coming from inside her head. Come closer. At that moment, her feet felt glued to the ground. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Then, from the corner of her eye, the stall door creaked open, inch by inch, something oozing out from within. Mocha couldn't breathe. The air in the restroom turned freezing cold. Then, a long skeletal hand emerged. Its claw-like fingers scraped against the grimy tiles, leaving deep scratches. But it didn't stop there. Behind her, another sound, a leg, a twisted limb. Its head snapped to the side like a broken doll, smiling as it crept toward her. And in the mirror, her reflection reached out, grabbing her wrist. Its sharp nails dug into her skin, pulling her toward the glass. Mocha screamed, struggling to break free from its icy grip. Overwhelmed with fear, her vision blurred. Staggering backward, she grabbed a soap dispenser and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered into countless shards, the sharp sound snapping her back to reality. She screamed. The stall door burst open. Mocha ran, stumbling, crashing onto the hallway floor. In that moment, she felt something brush against her hair from behind. In sheer panic, she ran without looking back. Back in class, Mocha tried to tell her friends about her horrifying experience, but they dismissed her, saying she was imagining things. From that day forward, no one believed her. She never returned to that restroom again, terrified of what she had seen. The memory of that day haunted her endlessly. She became paranoid about mirrors, always doubting their reflections, unable to look at them for too long, always needing to cover them up. Even to this day, Mocha does not want to know what she truly saw, but for the rest of her life, she will never forget what stared back at her from the mirror. From that day on, she developed a deep, unshakable fear of mirrors. The hunter and the burialer in the forest. Kevin, a hunter, decided to spend some time alone in the vast, untouched forests of Arizona. As the sun set and he finished setting up his tent, the crackling fire was the only sound breaking the silence. However, the stillness of the forest was soon disturbed by something strange. During the night, Kevin began hearing whispers. At first, he dismissed them as natural sounds of the forest, but they grew louder, making it nearly impossible for him to sleep. As the hours passed and morning arrived, Kevin shook it off and ventured deeper into the forest. A hunter's instinct left no room for fear. While exploring the forest, Kevin saw a dirty shoe, half buried in the soil. At first, he thought it was just trash, but then he realized there were bones. Digging around, he found scattered bones, resembling a graveyard of death. He tried convincing himself they belonged to animals, but deep inside, he felt something far darker was happening here. As he moved on around midday, he found remnants of a torn piece of clothing dangling eerily from tree roots, emitting a foul, sickening odor. Kevin knew that if his suspicions were correct, if this was a crime scene, the killer would surely return. He decided to come back the following night, fully prepared. Kevin brought small, hidden cameras, the kind that could blend with leaves or be placed on high branches to capture footage. He also found a secure spot to observe without being seen. As night fell, Kevin retreated to his hiding spot. Hours passed in silence, with only the sound of insects chirping. Then suddenly, footsteps. His heart pounded as he listened to the rustling leaves and snapping branches. Someone or something was moving. Through the dim glow of the moonlight, Kevin saw a man emerge from the trees. He wore a dark hoodie, his face hidden in the shadows. He carried 2 large black garbage bags, dripping with moisture, perhaps another package. His movements were precise, methodical, as if he had done this hundreds of times before. He stepped into the burial site, crouched down, and glanced at a piece of paper, muttering something. It was the note Kevin had planted near the area. "I know who you are. Be careful." A bait to provoke a reaction from the killer. The man panicked, looking around frantically, his breath quickening as if he were afraid. He turned away and began leaving the area, following a narrow trail deeper into the forest. Kevin waited until he was far enough, then silently followed, stepping lightly like a hunter stalking its prey. The path grew increasingly difficult, surrounded by thick tree trunks. After about 20 minutes of walking, Kevin spotted an old, rotting wooden cabin hidden deep in the dense forest. The man's flashlight flickered inside. Kevin pressed himself against a nearby tree, trying to get a clearer view of what was happening. What he saw inside was far more horrifying than he had imagined. Blood-stained old clothes hung on a line, a table with scattered bone fragments, remnants of something he didn't want to think about. Then, a large freezer sat ominously in the corner, seemingly holding something inside. Kevin knew he couldn't confront this man directly. He looked dangerous, far from an easy match. Kevin realized he needed to stay sharp. Quietly, he placed one of his cameras just outside, aimed at the entrance. Then, he strung a piece of wire across the pathway. If stepped on, it would send a large branch crashing down, making a loud noise. Moments later, the man stepped out of the cabin, gripping a large knife. He took a few steps forward and triggered the trap. The branch came crashing down with a loud thud, startling him. In his panic, he stumbled over a tree root and fell hard to the ground. Kevin didn't hesitate. He quickly retreated, taking the recorded footage with him. Kevin didn't report to the police, but he had his own plan. The next morning, he posted a series of images from the scene on an online forum dedicated to mysterious disappearances, along with an anonymous message. The post spread quickly. People who had lost loved ones in the area took notice. An amateur search party decided to enter the forest and investigate. The killer realized he had been exposed. He tried to flee, but there was nowhere left to hide. Cornered and out of options, he lost control and ended his own life in the very cabin he once used as a hideout. Vengeance of the soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The killer became nothing more than a memory, consumed by the very spirit he had created. The elevator of apartment 13. I had just moved into a new apartment building, a towering structure of steel and glass in the heart of the city. The building was modern, with sleek finishes, key-card access, and an array of amenities. But what attracted me most was the affordable rent, something almost too good to be true in this part of town. My apartment was on the 13th floor, which didn't bother me despite the superstitions surrounding that number. The first few weeks were uneventful. I was still settling in, getting used to the sounds of the city and the hum of the building. The neighbors were quiet, and I rarely saw anyone in the hallways or elevator. However, I began to notice something strange about the elevator itself. Every time I used it, it seemed to take longer to reach my floor, and there was always a strange clicking noise just before the doors opened. One evening, after a long day at work, I stepped into the elevator, ready to unwind in my apartment. The elevator was empty, as usual, and I pressed the button for the 13th floor. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the elevator began its ascent. As I leaned back against the wall, I felt the familiar sensation of the elevator moving, but then, abruptly, it stopped. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its screen as a makeshift flashlight. The elevator jolted, and the lights came back on, dimmer than before.
Help me!
The floor indicator showed that I was between the 12th and 13th floors. I pressed the buttons repeatedly, but nothing happened. Suddenly, the elevator began to descend slowly, as if under someone else's control. The air grew thick, and I felt a strange pressure on my chest, like something heavy was pressing down on me. The clicking noise started again, louder this time, echoing through the small space. I glanced at the ceiling, half expecting to see the source of the noise, but there was nothing there. The elevator stopped on the 10th floor, and the doors opened. I peered out into the hallway, which was eerily dark, the overhead lights flickering sporadically. My instincts told me to get out, but something held me back. There was a presence in the hallway, something unseen but undeniably there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I quickly pressed the closed door button, my hands trembling. The doors shut, and the elevator continued its descent, but the clicking noise didn't stop. It was almost rhythmic now, like footsteps above me. I stared at the ceiling, fear gripping me as the noise grew louder and faster. The elevator stopped again, this time on the 8th floor. The doors creaked open, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, just out of the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. The temperature in the elevator plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I slammed my hand on the buttons, desperate to get the elevator moving again, but it refused to respond. The shadow began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. Just as it reached the threshold of the elevator, the doors snapped shut, and the elevator plunged downward, faster than before. I held onto the railing, my heart pounding in my ears. The clicking noise was now deafening, as if whatever was in the elevator shaft was right above me, following me. The elevator stopped suddenly, the doors opening to the lobby. I stumbled out, gasping for air, and looked back just in time to see the shadowy figure standing in the elevator, its hand outstretched as if reaching for me. The doors closed, and the elevator ascended again, disappearing into the darkness of the shaft. Shaken, I reported the incident to the building management, but they found nothing wrong with the elevator. I moved out the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something malevolent was lurking in that elevator, something that wasn't bound by the rules of the living. To this day, I avoid elevators, especially in old buildings, and I'll never forget the feeling of that cold, oppressive presence in the apartment building of 13. It was a reminder that some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by something far more sinister. The woman disappeared in white clothes. I grew up hearing stories from my cousin, who worked at the local police station. He was the kind of person who had seen it all. But there's one story he told me that always sent chills down my spine, and it's true. This story is about the mysterious woman in white. It all started with a midnight call from a gas station attendant. My cousin's colleague, Officer Nathan, was working the night shift. The attendant claimed he had been robbed, and the thief fled before he called. A woman in a white dress with long black hair, incredibly beautiful. Strangely, the suspect wasn't a masked figure or some shady guy, but a woman. He explained that she had come to him, asking for help because she was lost in the middle of the night. He had gone to the office to notify his boss, but when they returned to the cash register, she was gone, and so was all the money. Nathan, the only officer on duty so late, immediately got in his patrol car and headed to the gas station. It was a deserted road, winding through the woods on the outskirts of town. As Nathan drove, his headlights caught movement up ahead. A dark shadow was slowly walking toward him. Walking alone in the opposite direction was a woman in a white dress. She matched the attendant's description exactly. He accidentally passed her by, but unsure if his eyes were deceiving him, he saw that she had no face as he drove by. Finding it too unbelievable, he slowed down and reversed to check if she was indeed the woman the gas station attendant had described. After reversing, he stopped and quickly stepped out of the car, saying, "You need to get in the car and come with me to the police station immediately." She said nothing and complied. On the drive back to the station, he asked her a few questions about why she had stolen the money. However, she didn't say a word. He looked through the rearview mirror as she sat in the back seat, staring intently at one spot until they arrived at the station. Her behavior was strange, so he thought the woman might have mental issues. After that, he decided not to ask her any more questions. When they got back to the station, they began interrogating her, but she still didn't speak. His shift was almost over, so he prepared to hand over the report to the incoming officers. Just before he was about to leave, she suddenly started talking. She gestured and spoke, promising to return the money the next day if they let her spend the night in the holding cell at the station. She kept insisting that she had nowhere to go, and the officers were quite confused by what she was saying, unsure of what to do. Nathan reported to his superiors. He was informed that they couldn't move her to another holding facility that day. So in the end, they agreed to her request and placed her in the holding cell. Before leaving, Nathan made a final call to the gas station, informing the attendant that they had caught the suspect. The money would be returned the next morning, or so they thought. The next morning, Nathan returned to the station. As he approached the woman's cell, he witnessed a horrifying scene. The cell was empty. The woman they had arrested the night before was gone, except for the crumpled body of a man, her cellmate. His face was shredded with deep scratches, his wide eyes frozen in terror, and his body was pinned to the wall with nails driven into the flesh. Scattered around him were bills, and a few banknotes that hadn't been found the day before were stuffed into his pockets. Worse still, scrawled in blood on the wall beside his body were the words, "I have paid the debt." Nathan frantically searched the area. Even more terrifying was that she had completely vanished. No one heard or saw anything. The cameras? They hadn't captured any footage of her entering or leaving the cell. She had disappeared without a trace. A thorough search was conducted. The surrounding area was combed, and every possible lead was followed. But the woman in white was never found. She simply vanished, like a ghost fading into the darkness. Even to this day, no one knows who or what she was, but the officers present that night remain haunted by the incident. That's the whole story my cousin told me. I sat and listened, and I could still see the fear in his eyes when he spoke about her. The question that always haunted me was how she managed to escape from the cell. Was she human, or something far worse? The strangest part is that she evaded all the surveillance cameras. After countless investigations, they still don't know what happened that night or where she went. Killer in the Rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and I called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet. But they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. The Yin and Yang train. The Midnight Express was a train shrouded in mystery and fear. It was said to appear only once a year on a stormy night, traveling through the remote countryside. Legend had it that those who boarded the train never returned. As a journalist for a local newspaper, I had always been skeptical of such tales, but I couldn't resist the lure of a good story. This year, I decided to investigate. It was a dark and stormy night, fitting for the task at hand. I drove to the old, abandoned train station where the Midnight Express was rumored to appear. The station was in disrepair, with weeds growing through the cracks in the platform and broken windows staring like empty eyes. The air was thick with anticipation and the distant rumble of thunder. I set up my camera and waited, the rain pouring down relentlessly. Just as I was beginning to doubt the legend, a distant whistle pierced the night. My heart raced as I saw the faint glow of the train's headlight approaching. The Midnight Express emerged from the darkness, an old steam engine with an eerie, almost spectral appearance. The train slowed to a halt, its doors creaking open. Despite my fear, I boarded the train, determined to uncover the truth. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, with plush seats and dim, flickering lights. The air inside was cold, and an unsettling silence hung over everything. I took a seat and prepared my notebook and camera, ready to document whatever I encountered. As the train began to move, I noticed that I was not alone. A few other passengers were scattered throughout the train, all of them staring straight ahead, their faces devoid of emotion. I tried to strike up a conversation with the man sitting across from me, but he remained silent, his eyes empty and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine. The train moved through the night, the storm raging outside. I decided to explore the other cars, hoping to find someone willing to talk. As I walked through the train, I noticed the passengers all had the same vacant expressions. They seemed more like mannequins than living people. My unease grew with each step. In the last car, I found a conductor. He was an old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me.
Can I help you?
He asked, his voice gravelly and cold. I told him I was a journalist investigating the Midnight Express and asked about the passengers.
They are souls trapped between this world and the next. This train is their purgatory, a place where they must confront their past sins before moving on.
I felt a chill as I realized the gravity of his words. Why am I here? I asked. The conductor's eyes darkened.
You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. You must face your own demons before you can leave.
Panic set in as I tried to leave the car, but the door wouldn't budge. The train began to feel like a prison, the walls closing in on me. I ran back to my seat, hoping to find some way out. The passengers' faces seemed to contort into grotesque masks, their eyes following my every move. Desperate, I looked out the window, but the landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar countryside, I saw scenes from my own life, moments of regret, guilt, and pain. The train was forcing me to confront my own past. As the storm outside intensified, so did my memories. I realized I had spent my life running from my mistakes, never facing the consequences of my actions. The train slowed to a stop, and the conductor appeared again.
It's time,
he said. With a deep breath, I stepped off the train and into the unknown, ready to confront my past and seek redemption. The Midnight Express disappeared into the night, leaving me alone on the platform, but no longer afraid. I had found my story, and it was one that I would carry with me forever. Blue flames. I live in a suburb where there aren't many opportunities for hiking or camping. I will go camping for the first time in a remote forest. I think it will be a perfect camping trip because the land is flat. At the end of the trail, there will be a small pond. I walked for about an hour, but was a bit disappointed as it was quite small and surrounded by mud. However, it was enough for me to experience lying on a boat in the midst of nature. Suddenly, a thick mist crept through the bushes, clinging to the ground like a living entity that looked like a zombie rising from a grave. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The sound of birds chirping echoed back, strangely distorted, indescribable. After setting up the tent in a drier spot, I asked him to take a walk around the lake because I saw quite a lot of interesting things around here. I wandered over to the other side of the pond, and there wasn't really much there, so I tried to go deeper. I suddenly discovered a mound of earth that looked like something had been buried recently, and it gradually emitted a very unpleasant smell. I turned my back. The fog was thick, covering the ghostly road, cold, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I started to head back to my camp, and by then, the sun was almost setting. I had a small lighter with me, so I used it to light a campfire and heat some food. I sat eating and chatting about everything with Tin. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. I was confused, wondering if there was anyone else out here besides us. Maybe I had disturbed them? As the sun set, I noticed a light hovering across the pond. It was within the trees just outside the pond, but I had walked there an hour earlier and knew there was nothing there. Tin jokingly said it might be a will-o'-the-wisp and that I should be careful or it would take me away. We joked around and then acted like nothing happened. At night, occasionally, I glanced over at the pond a bit. I wasn't sure what to do, but an hour later into the night, I saw from the corner of my eye that the light began to fade, and suddenly, a blue light flickered in the air and then disappeared. I didn't dare call Tin because he would punch me. I stared into the dark forest, feeling empty again. For about 10 minutes, I waited for the light to turn back on, but it didn't appear. That gave me chills, but I figured I must have been seeing things or dreaming. The dense forest was shrouded in darkness when my friend and I were suddenly awakened by a howling sound. Lights started flickering in front of the camp. I thought they were fireflies, so I asked Tin to go see because you rarely see this in the city. Tin and I decided to go on an adventure together. I must say we were really brave despite being a bit scared. Going deeper, the path opened up to a small clearing, surrounded by spindly trees with arrows on them. We immediately followed. Suddenly it was a mound. The ground around it was bare, as if nothing dared to grow near it. I approached and saw an ancient stone ring full of moss half buried in the ground. The air is thick with unspeakable fear, as if the stones themselves hold the memory of horrors. The tiny lights began to gather, swirling around each other to form a magical circle. This light illuminated the ground, creating strange patterns. My curiosity began to rise as I moved closer to take a closer look. I couldn't see clearly, but somewhere from under the mound of earth, something that looked like a horribly rotten hand like in those zombie movies emerged from the ground. Then the blue flames began to fly out rapidly like evil fireflies wanting to eat us, causing us to panic and not be able to run in time until we fell covered in mud. We started to panic. I screamed and waved a stick around instinctively, but Tin, being braver, took out his phone to take pictures. Moments later, we mysteriously lost consciousness and woke up near our tent. When I looked around, the blue light had vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling and the distant hooting of an owl. Tin, he took out his phone to check. The photos no longer seemed like a spiritual phenomenon. Just as dawn was breaking, we were too terrified and quickly left the forest, praying as we hurried away and vowing never to return. When I got back, I researched and found out that the forest was cursed with an ancient spell, which is why few people visit. We had gone without knowing. It was fortunate that we were still alive. Nightmare House on the Hillside. I was 6 or 7 years old when my parents divorced. My younger sister had just been born. My mother and stepfather decided to move into a new house, thinking it would be a fresh start for all of us, but it didn't turn out that way. It was an old house in the suburbs, built in the mid-1800s. It had 2 stories and a basement below. Down there was a door that led to water tanks used to heat the house, locked tight, with only my mom and the landlord having the key. We were warned not to go near it. I didn't understand why, but my room was always colder than the other rooms, even though it was right above the basement. I often heard strange creaking sounds, like someone walking on the floorboards. The house was quite old, and I would often see wasps coming from the attic. They swarmed as if drawn to something. I wasn't the only one who experienced strange things. My mom and stepfather often heard footsteps in the living room late at night, pacing back and forth, never stopping. But they brushed it off and said it was nothing. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with me. I turned over and saw a boy, his face obscured by shadows, wearing old-fashioned clothes, about my age, standing near my desk. I sat up in bed. He asked me if I wanted to play with his toys. I told him no, it was too late, and I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents. Then his expression changed, becoming angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from my cold room. I ran to tell my mom, but she reassured me it was just a dream. Still, I knew she didn't believe it either. I began to feel something was wrong with this house. The next night, it happened again. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She was standing on my bed. She stood hunched over, her tangled hair hanging down over my face. She stared at me with deep, hollow eyes that were completely black, her breath chilling as it hit my face. I jumped up, flung open the door, and ran to my sister's room. She was still asleep in her crib. I looked back at the door and saw the woman slowly walking toward me. As she passed the window, lightning struck outside, and in that moment, the woman disappeared. With each flash of lightning, she would reappear, getting closer to me. I woke up again, back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? But it felt too real. I ran to my mom and stepfather, telling them everything. Their faces went pale as I spoke, but they told me it was just a nightmare. It was a lie they had been telling me ever since we moved into that house. A few days later, we moved out. My mother didn't say why, but I could tell by the way she hurried us out of the house that something had scared her too. It wasn't until many years later that she told me. The landlord eventually confessed what had happened in the house long ago. During the Civil War, a widowed mother and her 3 children lived there. After her husband was killed in battle, the woman's mind shattered. You ever or roll. In a fit of madness, she killed the rest of her family in the living room before dragging their bodies down to the water tank room in the basement. These things explained what I had experienced in that house, from the moved items to my toys being displaced. The boy I saw was one of her children, still trapped in the house, either searching for companionship or perhaps seeking revenge. And the woman, the one who stood over my bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horrors she had endured. I often wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in that house. Would we have become part of their story? Would that woman have done to us what she had done to her own children? I will never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still think about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. Strange clown in the parking lot. It was a chilly October evening in 2016, just a few weeks before Halloween. My friends, Jake and Sarah, and I decided to catch a late-night movie at the local theater. After the movie, which ended around midnight, we lingered in the parking lot, chatting and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by a few dim streetlights, creating long shadows that danced eerily around us. As we laughed about the horror movie we had just seen, Jake suddenly fell silent, staring behind us. We turned to see a clown standing by an old, beat-up car at the edge of the parking lot. He was dressed in a dirty, oversized clown suit with a red wig and smeared white face paint. Unlike the clowns at birthday parties, this one had a sinister air about him, his smile too wide and his eyes too dark. At first, we thought it was a prank. After all, clown sightings had become a bizarre trend that year. But as he started walking towards us, the playful notion quickly vanished. His movements were slow and deliberate, and in his gloved hand, he held a balloon that bobbed menacingly with each step. Nervously, we decided to head to Jake's car, which was parked a short distance away. We tried to act casual, but our pace quickened with each step. The clown followed, maintaining a steady, unnerving pace. My heart pounded as we reached the car and scrambled inside. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Just as we locked the doors, the clown reached the car. He leaned against the driver's side window, his face inches away from Jake's. He pressed the balloon against the glass and slowly dragged his finger down the window, leaving a streak in the condensation. We could see his eyes clearly now, cold and calculating. He tapped on the glass, the sound echoing in the silent parking lot. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. The clown then moved to the front of the car, standing directly in the headlights. He reached into his oversized pocket and pulled out a long, jagged knife. The sight of the blade sent a fresh wave of panic through us. Jake finally snapped out of his shock and started the car. The engine roared to life, and the clown took a step back, still smiling that unsettling smile. We peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching, and didn't stop until we were miles away, parked in front of a 24-hour diner. We sat in the car, catching our breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. We debated calling the police, but without any real harm done, we doubted they'd take us seriously. In the end, we decided to keep the story to ourselves, not wanting to relive the terrifying encounter. To this day, the image of that clown and his menacing smile haunts us. We often wonder what his intentions were and shudder at the thought of what might have happened if we hadn't reached the car in time. The experience left a lasting impression, a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones that seem to step straight out of a nightmare. The crazy mother on campus. Exam season had arrived, and normally our school library would close, but because of the exams, the school decided to keep it open until midnight. My house is not far from the school, so instead of studying at home, I prefer to study in the quiet and peaceful library. That day, I left home at 6 o'clock, engrossed in my studies, and didn't realize that it was already 10 p.m. I had never stayed this late before. The ticking clock was loud, each second echoing in the emptiness, signaling that it was nearly midnight. Strangely, there were hardly any students studying at that hour. It was absolute silence. I finished my work and headed home. The library is at the end of the hallway, so as usual, I walked down the long, dark corridor of the school. But today, I felt an unusual chill in the air. It was empty and the silence was suffocating. I walked through the hallway and quickly approached the exit. I walked fast, the sound of my footsteps echoing ominously. The once familiar campus now felt strange and frightening. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The path narrowed as I entered the school garden, the lights becoming fewer. A sudden loud snap of a branch made me stop dead in my tracks. I spun around, heart racing, but saw only shadows. Exhausted and hungry, I could barely walk properly. I kept my eyes on the ground as I walked. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a woman walking with a strange, crippled gait. Her legs seemed twisted, making it difficult for her to walk. She moved like a zombie. Now I was close enough to see her clearly. Her clothes were torn and filthy, her hair hanging in tangled clumps around her ghostly pale face. My heart pounded in my chest as the woman limped toward me, her eyes staring as if she wanted to pounce on me. I backed away, fear enveloping me. The uneven footsteps of the woman grew louder, echoing in the empty night. She pursued me relentlessly. I ran aimlessly until I reached the school parking lot, desperately searching for a place to hide. The parking lot was eerily empty. I hid behind a car, my breath coming in ragged gasps from the exhausting chase. But she did not tire. She searched for me with a crazed determination. From my hiding spot, I saw the woman moving past the cars, her head turning from side to side, searching. I felt truly terrified and breathless. The woman stopped near my hiding place. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound, and prayed she wouldn't see me. Thankfully, she just stood there, scouting the area, and then turned and continued moving. Seizing the opportunity, I bolted from my hiding spot, running towards the dormitory. The lights of the building were a beacon of hope, but the woman's footsteps grew louder behind me. I didn't care about anything else. I just ran, fearing for my life. I reached the dormitory entrance, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keypad. I could hear the woman's labored breathing right behind me. Finally, the door clicked open, and I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. I looked through the glass, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. The campus was dark and silent. I collapsed onto my bed, my mind racing with the terror of what had just happened. The image of the woman's pale, haunting face was etched into my memory. The next morning, I was determined to find out more about what I had experienced. I asked the groundskeeper who tended to the school's garden. He looked quite old, so I thought he might know something. I asked him, and he said that in 1998, there was a 32-year-old woman who had a 20-year-old daughter who also attended this school. One day, while playing with her friends, the daughter mysteriously had an accident on the school grounds and died. The mother couldn't bear the thought that her daughter might have been bullied or something terrible had happened to her that she didn't know about. Losing her daughter drove her mad, and she would appear and disappear erratically. I decided I would never walk alone on the school grounds again. For the sake of my safety, the danger was too real and could strike at any moment.
The curse of the top students. The school stood tall and intimidating with its Gothic architecture, old and worn, with ivy creeping up the walls. The atmosphere always felt gloomy. The walls were adorned with old portraits of past headmasters and notable students, their eyes seemingly following anyone who passed by. The floor creaked with every step. Elena, a studious girl in her late teens, was seated at a desk near the back of the classroom, immersed in a book. The room was empty except for her, and the silence was suffocating. The school had a bookshelf dedicated to the history and legends of the school over the years. It was quite large and sparked her curiosity to learn more. Elena searched through the archives, looking for information about a mysterious curse she had heard rumors about. While reading an old history book about the school's founding, she came across a leather-bound book, aged and ancient. Unexpectedly, a page with a paper bookmark revealed a section about the curse of the good and top students at the school. Years ago, the school had been plagued by a series of unexplained events. The top students began disappearing under mysterious circumstances, their academic excellence seemingly attracting a dark force. Shadows moved on their own, and strange whispers filled the hallways. Elena read about how the curse started with a student who made a pact with an unknown entity to achieve academic success. The price was their soul, and the curse had haunted the school ever since. Elena left school to go home. She started to feel scared because she was one of the top students at the school. She hadn't witnessed anything herself, so everything seemed vague to her, caught between reality and fiction. As she descended the stairs, the eyes of the portrait seemed to follow her, glowing faintly and eerily in the light. Elena entered the bathroom to splash water on her face, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. She looked up into the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Her breathing became rapid, and she quickly left. Elena sought refuge in the science lab, hoping to find a logical explanation for the strange events. As she flipped through a textbook, the lights flickered and went out. She heard a low growl and saw beakers and test tubes rattling on their own. A cold breeze brushed past her, sending shivers down her spine. Panic. Elena ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly. She heard whispers of her name, growing louder and more urgent. She stumbled and fell, the whispers now a cacophony of sinister voices. Beware, your turn will come. Desperate, Elena burst into the headmaster's office, hoping to find answers. The office was dark and cluttered with old papers and books. The headmaster's chair slowly turned to reveal a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Elena screamed and backed away, tripping over a stack of books. Elena fled the building, her heart pounding. She looked back at the school, which now seemed even more menacing under the moonlight. As Elena ran across the school grounds, she felt a presence chasing her. She reached the gates and looked back one last time. There was a dark shadow peering out from the window. Safe back in her room, Elena tried to calm herself, but the events of the night kept replaying in her mind. She opened her laptop and began writing about the curse, determined to warn others. As she typed, she felt a strange sensation. A shadowy figure lunged towards Elena. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure grabbed her arm, and she was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of terrifying visions. Students being dragged into darkness, their faces twisted in silent screams, and the entity that started the curse grinning maliciously. Elena saw the student who made the pact, standing before a dark figure with glowing eyes, signing a blood-soaked contract. Elena snapped back to reality, the shadowy figure gone. She was left shivering, a dark mark on her arm where the figure had grabbed her. The screen faded to black, and the only sound was a whisper. Good luck. If you don't leave, you will be next. She didn't know if the curse would follow her, but with such a warning, she decided not to stay another minute. The next day, she left and transferred to a different school. Not long after, the school was abandoned due to rumors, and students gradually left.
The creepy secret of the cheap motel. On our anniversary, we had a memorable time in every sense at an old suburban area. The bus ride took forever, and before we knew it, the sun was setting. Since we traveled by bus, it took more time, and soon it was evening. I didn't realize it was festival season there, so it was quite expensive and crowded. We found a very cheap place to stay, although it was a bit hard to find. I think the problem was that we entered any nearby place without considering the location. We prepared a simple dinner, shared stories, and then picked a movie to watch together. Suddenly, Min told me she started feeling a bit tired and dizzy, probably exhausted from the whole day. We decided to go to bed early to be ready for our plans the next day. I quickly fell asleep. However, Min found herself tossing and turning, unable to find a comfortable position and mumbling something softly. When she finally started to drift off, she told me she felt a strange sensation taking over her. Suddenly, my eyes opened for no reason. I usually sleep deeply and rarely wake up in the middle of the night unless someone shakes me awake. But my girlfriend, who was sleeping next to me, turned over, and I woke up due to her movement. Around midnight, Min started tossing and turning in her sleep. Her face was contorted with discomfort, and she began sweating profusely. Her skin was pale and clammy, and her breathing became strange and irregular. I opened my eyes slightly and saw my girlfriend get up and walk to the bathroom. Her movements were stiff, almost puppet-like, as if an invisible force was guiding her. At that moment, I saw a dark shadow following her. It wasn't her shadow because it had no hair on its head. Instead, it was a black figure with hands and feet moving independently, not matching her movements. It had no eyes, nose, or mouth, but it resembled a human figure. I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena without scientific evidence, but I definitely thought something was wrong. When I fully woke up, I jumped out of bed and ran to the bathroom where my girlfriend had gone. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then, I heard the laughter of a middle-aged man from inside. I remember it clearly because I wasn't drunk and was definitely alert. Slowly turning the locked doorknob, I shouted my girlfriend's name. "Open the door." I stood outside the bathroom, anxiety engulfing me. But there was no sound from inside, and the door remained closed. I still can't recall if the next part was a dream or reality. The laughter grew louder and more terrifying. I hesitated but finally mustered the courage to open the door, only to find the bathroom empty. I thought long and hard about what had happened and went back to bed to try and collect myself. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and I felt a chilling sensation run down my spine. I nearly fainted when I saw it. My girlfriend was standing on the bed, staring at me with wide eyes as if possessed by something, then gave me a terrifying smile. I had been dating her for nearly 2 years, but had never seen such a horrifying smile before. Her eyes, once warm and loving, now held a chilling emptiness. She laughed again, the sound echoing through the room, sending shivers down my spine. I grabbed her shoulders and shook her hard, but she just fell back into sleep. I couldn't sleep that night and waited until morning with my eyes wide open. Min woke up and advanced towards me, her laughter becoming louder and more hysterical. I recoiled, my mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. The previously cozy bedroom had transformed into a nightmarish enclosure. I tried to reach Min, hoping to pull her out of whatever trance she was in. She went silent, her body collapsing to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. I immediately took her to the hospital because she had fainted, feeling less afraid in the daylight despite not believing much in the supernatural. I began to clean up and quickly got out of the rental. As we left the rental, I asked her if she remembered anything from the previous night, but she seemed unaware of what had happened. I didn't tell her anything because I thought she would be scared if I detailed the events. But now, after 10 years, I suddenly recalled the incident and started researching the rental. It turns out that there had been several murders and suicides there over the past few decades. The media didn't directly mention the name of the place, but I'm certain it's the right one after. Reading some reviews about the accommodation. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m., The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless. No hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Abandoned house on Halloween. The dim light of Halloween decorations danced on the walls, casting strange shadows that seemed to come alive. This was the day I had always looked forward to. My friends were out gathering candy, but I was too anxious to join them this year. As I stared into the flickering light of the TV, I couldn't shake the feeling that this Halloween would be different. Finally, I gathered the courage to step outside. I trudged down the street, admiring the carved pumpkins and spooky decorations adorning the houses. I approached a house at the end of the block that I had never noticed before. The house looked abandoned, with peeling paint on the walls and overgrown weeds. A shiver ran down my spine, but curiosity drew me closer. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed a flickering light inside. My heart raced. Should I knock? The porch creaked beneath my feet, and I took a deep breath before raising my hand to the door. Before I could knock, the door swung open on its own, revealing a pitch-black entrance. The smell of mildew and rot hit my nose, and I hesitantly called out to see if anyone was home. But it was completely silent, so I cautiously stepped inside. Darkness stretched across the walls, and I could see old furniture covered in dust sheets. I spotted an old pumpkin lantern flickering in the corner, its flame casting dancing shadows. I felt a strange pull toward the back of the house, where I saw a flickering light coming through a window. I cautiously made my way down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. My heart raced as I approached the doorway, the light growing brighter. But as I reached for the doorknob, a sudden chill ran down my spine. I paused, sensing an unsettling energy in the air. Then, without warning, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned to see the door I had just passed through slowly closing, as if someone or something was pushing it shut. Panic surged within me. I forced the door open, only to reveal a cluttered living room shrouded in darkness. And then, there he was. An old man sat in a rocking chair, dressed in tattered clothes, with a long beard and wild hair. His eyes sunk deep into his face. He rocked slowly back and forth, making the chair creak in the silence, thickening the atmosphere. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but I couldn't take my eyes off his movements. As I took a step back, wanting to retreat, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged within me. I was trapped in this old, eerie house with a strange, terrifying man. Suddenly, the old man spoke, his voice hoarse and deep. "You've come for the treats, haven't you?" My throat tightened as I nodded slowly, fear coursing through me. I could hardly make out his features in the dim light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of something that looked like candy, extending his hand toward me, saying it was specially for me. But something felt off. It looked dark and uninviting. Just then, I heard a crash from another room, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I needed to get out. I dashed toward the front door, my heart racing as I pulled on the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. I twisted and struggled to open it in desperation. The old man's laughter echoed behind me, sending chills down my spine. "Stay a while. I have plenty of candy," he called, his voice dripping with malice. Panic surged within me as I pulled at the front door, but it stubbornly remained shut. The old man's laughter echoed around me, filling me with dread. I glanced back at him, the flickering lantern casting eerie shadows that made him appear even more terrifying. My mind raced with fear and desperation for a way out. I stepped back from the door and scanned the room for another exit. I spotted a window on the far side, partially obscured by tattered curtains. That was when he stood up. He took a step closer. "You shouldn't be here, kid." Ignoring him, I rushed toward the window, fear propelling me forward. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers trembling, but it was stuck tight. I felt tears welling up as if some unseen force was preventing me from escaping the darkness of this house. I glanced back at the old man, who was now only inches away, his smile widening with delight as he watched me trapped. In a moment of desperation, I looked back down the dark hallway that led further into the house. Perhaps there was another escape route. I dashed forward, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling of being watched. The flickering lantern behind me illuminated strange images painted on the walls, pictures of children, lost and weeping. My heart raced as I reached another door at the end of the hallway. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. The kitchen was eerily quiet, filled with the stench of decay and rot. I glanced around, searching for an exit. The back door appeared at the end, partially ajar, promising freedom. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards behind me. I turned to see the old man stepping into the kitchen, blocking my only escape. His voice was hoarse as he stared at me. "We're just getting started." I threw myself against the door, desperate to escape. The door swung open, and I tumbled into the backyard. As I turned back after the fall, The terrifying face of the old man loomed before me. I felt breathless at the sight of him. Despite the pain from my fall, I didn't hesitate any longer. I bolted through the yard, glancing back to see the old man standing in the doorway, his figure framed by the dim light of the kitchen. I reached the fence surrounding the backyard, my mind racing. The only escape was over the tall wooden slats, but I had no time to hesitate. I climbed up, my fingers gripping the splintered wood, heart pounding as I launched myself over to the other side. I landed awkwardly in the neighbor's yard, rolling to my feet and sprinting into the street. Not only that, terror surged as I hit the ground. The neighbor's dog burst out, barking furiously as if it wanted to devour me. I panicked, crawling on the ground to escape this madness. I could hear nothing but the blood pounding in my ears as I ran onto the main road. The Halloween decorations lining the street now looked terrifying, their shadows stretching under the moonlight. I sprinted down the street, glancing back at the house. Terrified the old man was watching me. I couldn't slow down. I needed to get home, to safety. Each breath became labored as I turned the corner, and the familiar sight of my house came into view. I burst through the gate and rushed to the front door, my fingers fumbling at the lock as I desperately tried to get inside. I flung the door open and stumbled into the safety of my home. Gasping for breath, heart pounding, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it immediately and sliding down against the door. My mom was still at work, and the house felt eerily quiet. As I peered outside, a figure moved through the yard. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted, but thankfully it was just a neighbor walking their dog. I exhaled, relief flooding through me, but it didn't last long. As I lay in bed that night, darkness enveloped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the old man was still out there, waiting in the shadows. Perhaps this Halloween would be one filled with terror for me. The troublemaker at Starbucks. Lai had just graduated from college and found a temporary job, which left her struggling to find a place to live. Lai rented a small apartment near a Starbucks, where she worked as a barista. Starbucks was a hangout spot for local musicians and artists, the kind of crowd who knew their coffee. It stayed open until midnight, sometimes even later on weekends. Lai worked the night shift, a shift most employees weren't fond of. The pay was decent, though not great, but the shifts were quiet. However, there was always something unsettling about the empty cafe late at night, especially toward closing time. She spent most of her time cleaning and making coffee to keep herself busy. Nick, a friend of Lai's, would sometimes drop by to keep her company. He knew everyone who worked there. But one summer night, everything changed. Nick wasn't there that evening. He didn't show up because he was attending a friend's wedding, leaving Lai to face the night shift alone. By midnight, she had made only $10 in tips, and the store was almost entirely empty. But she felt grateful that she didn't have to deal with any difficult customers. She went to the back room to fill the mop bucket and started cleaning the floor. The silence was peaceful, but something felt off. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow pass by the front window. Lai glanced up, but no one was there. She called out, asking if anyone was there, thinking a customer had come in through the back door, but there was no response. After a moment of hesitation, she shrugged, thinking she had imagined it, and went back to cleaning behind the counter. Suddenly, she heard the bathroom door open. Lai's heart started pounding, and she felt uneasy. She hadn't seen anyone come in, and the store had been completely empty just minutes before. To her surprise, Nick walked out of the bathroom. A wave of relief washed over her, and she smiled, calling out,
Nick, what are you doing here?
He grinned back at her, saying he had just dropped by after the wedding, but something in his expression had changed. His usual friendly demeanor had turned into something unsettling. She gave an awkward smile, brushing off the strange feeling, and offered him a drink. As she started making an espresso, Lai glanced at him. He was staring at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Lai tried to act normal and asked him what he was up to. Nick didn't respond. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a USB drive. His smile widened as he tossed it onto the counter. She stared at it, confused, asking what it was. Nick leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. He said he had recorded something Lai wouldn't want anyone else to see. She didn't understand what he was talking about. He stood up straight, crossing his arms. Nick threatened her about some private conversations she had with her boss. Panic started to rise in her, and she yelled that he was lying. Nick shook his head, his smile never fading. Her mind raced, trying to figure out if he was lying, but the confidence in his voice made it clear that he wasn't. He chuckled softly, stepping closer. He spoke to Lai with crude words. He had initially planned to blackmail her, but now he didn't need to, and he thought it was time for Lai to show some appreciation for all the nights he'd kept her company. A nauseating feeling rose in Lai's throat as she realized what he was implying. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, screaming that he was insane and that she hadn't done anything. Nick's smile turned sinister. Her hands trembled, barely able to breathe as she tried to figure out how to escape. The store was closed, and the doors were locked. She was alone with him, and he was moving in, ready to corner her. She backed away and pleaded with him. His expression darkened, saying he had spent too much time helping without getting anything in return. He reached behind his back and pulled out a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. She glanced around the room, desperately searching for a way to escape. Her eyes landed on the espresso machine, and an idea formed in her mind. Lai tried to stall him and suggested making him a cup of coffee first. Nick raised an eyebrow but didn't object. She hurried behind the counter, her hands trembling as she poured an espresso. Her heart raced as she reached for the panini press. Without warning, Lai grabbed it and swung it at Nick's head with all her strength. The metal struck the side of his skull, and he staggered back, dropping the knife. Blood trickled down his face, and he let out a groan of pain. But the blow wasn't enough to bring him down. She needed to act fast. Lai ran around the counter, her eyes fixed on Nick as he wiped the blood from his face and started moving toward her. She frantically scanned the room for another weapon or an escape. Nick moved slowly, deliberately, as if he knew Lai had nowhere to run. His smile had vanished, replaced by a grim expression. She backed up toward the rear of the cafe, her mind racing to come up with a plan. The mop bucket was still near the back door. If only she could reach it. With trembling hands, she lunged for the mop bucket, grabbed the metal handle, and swung it at him. Nick dodged the first blow, but she swung again, striking him in the ribs. He groaned in pain, stumbling backward. She didn't stop. She swung again, this time aiming for his legs. It sent Nick crashing to the ground with a pained yell, clutching his knee. She seized the opportunity and ran for the back door. Lai fumbled with the lock as Nick struggled to get up. She finally managed to open the door and dashed out into the alley behind the store. She kept running, too afraid to look back as she heard Nick's footsteps behind her. He was limping, but he was still chasing her. Lai rounded a corner and spotted a large metal dumpster near the end of the alley. She crouched behind it, holding her breath. Her heart was pounding so fast it felt like it might burst out of her chest. From her hiding spot, she heard Nick stumble into the alley. His breathing was heavy, labored from the pain, and then his bitter voice called out, asking where she was, saying it wasn't over yet. Lai covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stay as silent as possible, not daring to move. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, the wail of sirens in the distance. Maybe someone had heard the commotion and called the police. Nick began limping back toward the Starbucks, his footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared into the night. Her legs were shaking so much, she could barely stand. She knew she had to leave before he came back. As she stumbled onto the street, she saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. I felt a wave of relief and waved for help. A short time later, Lai was brought to the interrogation room at the police station. The officers came in and told her that Nick had been arrested. He had been hiding in the cafe, trying to erase the security footage. The relief was immense. It was finally over. Nick had been arrested, and the evidence against him was undeniable. He would be charged with multiple crimes, including assault and attempted blackmail. The nightmare was over, and Nick would pay for everything he had done. The Stranger's Chase at Dunkin' Donut. It was just another regular shift at Dunkin', where I work part-time. The night shift is my usual shift, and tonight was no different. We usually close at 9 p.m., and I've grown used to the quiet that settles over the store as night falls. We had to clean up everything, and my coworker hadn't shown up yet. But that wasn't unusual. I was fine handling the store by myself. The inside of this Dunkin' was larger than most, with a few booths and tables scattered around. I had spent the last few hours in silence. No one had come in, and the last customer had left by 8:30 p.m. With only a few minutes left until closing, I walked around as usual, wiping down tables and making sure everything was tidy. As I passed by, heading back to the counter to clean up, something made my heart race. I hadn't noticed him before, but there was a man crouched down, almost hiding in the corner, completely out of sight from behind the counter. Everything seemed to freeze as his eyes locked with mine the moment I saw him. For a second, neither of us moved. The man slowly stood up. He was of average height, skinny, with messy hair and disheveled clothes. I asked him if he was okay, my voice trembling as I tried to stay calm. He didn't respond right away, mumbling that he was fine. I reminded him that we were closing and he needed to leave. He nodded and started walking toward the door. For a moment, I thought everything was fine. But then, without warning, he turned around and sprinted toward the counter with a crazed look on his face. Everything happened so fast. He didn't head for the door. He ran straight behind the counter, his eyes locked on the cash register. I began to realize what was happening. Without hesitation, I made for the exit, my mind racing. I didn't care about the cash register. I just needed to get out. Guys like him are dangerous, and they usually carry weapons. I had to be smart about this. But before I could reach the door, his voice rang out, loud and threatening. He shouted, his voice filled with anger. Stop. Froze for a second, but instinct kicked in, and I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and ran out, without looking back. I thought he would be inside to rob the store, but I was wrong. He chased after me, running through the parking lot, and fear gripped me like never before. I looked around the area, but most of the stores were dark and closed. I spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope. I ran faster, my breath quickening, and he was still behind me. The distance between us seemed to shrink. I burst into the gas station, my chest heaving with each breath. It was the closest place still open. As I ran inside, I shouted for someone to call the police. My voice was panicked and full of fear, echoing through the empty space. The clerk behind the counter and a lone customer turned to look at me. Startled, I ran past them, heading straight for the back of the store. A small restroom sign caught my attention. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I rushed inside. The flickering light in the small restroom, combined with the smell of bleach, heightened my tension. I was shaking uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Was he following me? Was he out there, lurking? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that whatever awaited me outside wasn't over. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the bathroom door and peeked outside. The gas station was eerily silent. The cashier was no longer behind the counter, and the customer had disappeared. I cautiously stepped out further. The dim lights cast long shadows over the shelves. I walked carefully, my own footsteps suddenly too loud. My eyes darted to the door, but there was no sign of the man outside. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Then I saw him. Through the glass window, his face appeared pale and terrifying. His wild eyes pressed against the glass like something from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He smiled grotesquely, almost stretching from ear to ear. Then he breathed onto the glass, writing the word "run." It felt like a challenge, daring me to try escaping. He slowly dragged his finger down the window, the screeching sound sending chills down my spine. He was waiting, like a predator, knowing that eventually I would have to come out. Panic surged within me again. I rushed toward the back exit, hoping it would lead to some way out. As I pushed the door open, I found myself outside again, this time in the alley behind the station. My breath fogged the cold air as I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide. The alley was narrow, with tall brick walls on either side, dark and unwelcoming. A few trash bins lined the path, but it was mostly empty. I had to make a choice. The only way out was forward or back to the gas station, where he might be waiting for me. I didn't have time to think. I started running, my body moving on instinct. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, nothing behind me. Still, fear gripped me tightly. This alley too dark, too unknown, leaving me vulnerable to whatever could come. I turned the corner and was met with a dead end. My heart sank as I saw the towering chain link fence blocking my way. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud, and feel the cold sweat on my skin. Maybe there was no way out. Footsteps echoed behind me, slow. Maybe he was coming closer. My body froze in place as the sound grew louder, the rhythm unsettling in its calmness. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My back pressed against the cold brick wall as I realized I had no other choice but to face him. He appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes locked onto mine with that twisted smile. His steps slowed as he moved into the faint light, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. In his hand, he held an iron rod. My heart was pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking. Then he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was low, mocking, and dragged the iron bar across the road with screeching sounds. My mind seemed to be spinning. I scanned the alley, desperately searching for anything that could help me. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken brick lying near the trash cans. I knew it wasn't enough to stop him, but I had no other choice. It was all I had. He stopped just inches from me, smirking. "You really think that's going to stop me?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As he took one more step toward me, I swung the brick with all my strength. In the moment, he was too focused on taunting me. Turning away smugly, I threw the brick, and it hit him square in the head. For a second, everything froze. He staggered back, the smile vanishing from his face as blood trickled down his forehead. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I seized the moment and ran. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sound of sirens tore through the night air in the distance. The police were coming, but I didn't stop running. Right then, the screech of tires cut through the air as police cars appeared. 3 patrol cars pulled into the gas station, red and blue lights flashing furiously. I could see the officers jump out, guns drawn, moving with urgency. I tried to shout, trembling as I pointed toward the alley. "He's over there." The officer nodded quickly and signaled to the others. They disappeared into the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they shouted commands. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, running toward the parking lot. But this time he wasn't alone. The police were right behind him. His wild eyes darted in every direction as he desperately searched for a way out, but he was surrounded. The police quickly tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, his voice twisted with rage, sending chills down my spine. But now, I was truly safe. The flashing lights of the police cars began to fade as I sat on the cold sidewalk, trying to piece together everything that had happened. It was over, but the horror still lingered. Trucker's secret mission. Another long and quiet night on the highway. The road stretched endlessly before me, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. I had been driving this road for years, working undercover as a long-haul truck driver. My real job was much more dangerous, tracking criminals, operating on these desolate roads under the cover of darkness. I am an undercover cop. My truck is my weapon, my disguise, and my hideout. Tonight was supposed to be like any other night, but I had a feeling, something gnawing at the back of my mind, telling me that tonight would be different, so I needed to be extra cautious. The road was deserted. The only sounds were my engine and the occasional rustle of wind over the barren landscape. I kept my eyes on the road, scanning the distance for any signs of trouble. Criminals often use these isolated highways to conduct their business, and I've made it my mission to stop them. Suddenly, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside, waving for me to stop. It was late, too late for anyone to be out here. My instincts kicked in immediately. Something was off. I slowed down and stopped by the roadside. The man approached, his face shrouded in darkness. He looked disheveled, almost deranged. As he got closer, I could see his clothes were torn and filthy. His hands twitched nervously at his sides, and there was a wild look in his eyes. I cautiously rolled down my window. "Do you need help?" But there was something about this guy, something dangerous. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled a slow, eerie smile that sent chills down my spine. Then, he pulled something out from under his coat, a small black box. I recognized it immediately. It was a vial containing a dangerous, illegal substance, something that could be lethal on contact. My heart beats fast. This is no ordinary hitchhiker. He is a dangerous man, and his target is me. The man stepped closer, holding the vial in one hand and a small knife in the other. "Get out of the truck," he said, his voice low and threatening, "or I'll make sure you don't make it through the night." I knew what was in that vial. It was a more dangerous weapon than the knife he held. Just one drop could incapacitate me, or worse, kill me. He knew it too. That's why he smiled like that. I kept my cool. My training kicked in. I had dealt with guys like him before, unpredictable and dangerous. But this time was different. He wasn't just a criminal, he was playing a twisted game, and I was his target tonight. I slowly unlocked the door, my mind racing as I tried to think of my next move. The man continued to smile, his eyes gleaming with some sick satisfaction. "Come on," he taunted, waving the knife. "Get out of the truck, Brian." I froze. How did he know my name? I had never met this guy in my life, yet he knew who I was. He stepped closer, holding up the vial. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Driving around here pretending to be a hero. catching guys like me. I've been watching you for a long time." The truth hit me like a punch. This wasn't random. He had planned this, but maybe he didn't know I was really a cop. I climbed out of the truck, raising my hands to show compliance. My mind raced, searching for an opportunity. The man circled around me, still grinning like a madman. He sneered, starting to pace back and forth, waving the knife and vial as he spoke. His words grew more erratic. He muttered something about me stealing it from him, but I couldn't even remember what it was. I racked my brain, trying to recall him. I had taken down countless criminals in my time. Drug dealers, traffickers, murderers. Any of them could have a grudge. But this guy, his face didn't ring any bells. His eyes burned with hatred as he said, "Now I'm going to ruin your life." He stepped closer, waving the vial in front of me. He whispered, "Just one drop, and it'll all be over." I stood still, watching his every move. He was too close, too confident. He thought he had won, but he was careless, distracted by his own need for revenge. Suddenly, luck was on my side. As he rambled, I noticed a flaw in his plan, the way he loosely held the knife. How distracted he was. He was too immersed in his own twisted game. Luckily, every time I went on a mission, I always wore gloves to protect myself from hazardous materials. Without warning, I lunged forward, knocking the vial from his hand, sending it skidding across the pavement. He was shocked, but not for long. He swung the knife at me, but I was ready because I had been through it and knew how to handle it. I grabbed his wrist and twisted until he dropped the blade. The struggle was quick and brutal. I used every trained skill to subdue him, pinning him to the ground before he could react. He thrashed, cursing and screaming, but it was over. I had him. As I held him down, panting from the exertion, I asked, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" He just laughed a cold, empty laugh. I stared at him, the pieces falling into place. He was one of the first criminals I had ever apprehended, a drug trafficker. He didn't forget I waited, planned, burned my hatred for years. I squeezed him. His words stabbed deeper than any weapon. He didn't pursue money or drugs or even freedom. He pursues revenge aimlessly and empty. Once he was subdued, I discreetly pressed for backup, making sure no one knew my true identity, while I waited for the other officers to arrive. I couldn't shake the chill down my spine. This man, this forgotten criminal, had built his entire life around destroying me. The lights of the patrol cars approached. This job wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about the shadows that follow you, carrying grudges from the past that never truly go away. My colleagues took him away. For every criminal I took down, there would be another waiting, another with a grudge, another seeing me as the one who ruined their lives. But now I understood more. The real danger wasn't out there on the road. It was in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Man in black cloak. The sun shone down on a small village nestled among towering mountains. An old suspension bridge stretched across the rushing St. River, its wooden planks creaking in the wind. His name was Brandon, and he was sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of books as he prepared for the bar exam. The stress weighed heavily on him, and he decided to take a break in a secluded spot. Stepping outside, the chilly late October air hit him. Brandon walked past a few nearby houses, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot creating a soothing sound. As he approached the suspension bridge, he gazed at the rushing river below. He closed his eyes, taking in the fresh air of nature. Suddenly, he felt the presence of someone nearby. He opened his eyes and saw a man in a black cloak standing in the middle of the bridge, fully shrouded. Brandon's heart raced as he saw the man drawing something on the railing of the bridge. A sense of unease rose within him, and he chose to avoid the man. turning back toward the forest along the riverbank. The overgrown trail ahead was thick with brush. He carefully tread over the uneven ground, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety after his encounter with the man. Emerging from the foliage, he reached the creek's edge. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. A brief sense of peace washed over him, but it was fleeting. In the fading light, Brandon saw flickering flames ahead. Confusion filled him, as he had expected to be alone out here. Curiosity rose despite his unease. Brandon moved closer, the crackling sound of the fire growing louder. As he approached, he saw 3 people in black cloaks standing around a man who looked injured, bound and covered in blood, lying on the ground. He could only hold his breath in fear. The flickering torchlight cast strange shadows, making the scene even more horrifying. They chanted ominously, in a language Brandon couldn't understand. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the terrifying sight. Panic rose within him, and he knew he needed to leave. One of the cloaked figures pulled out a knife, and Brandon's instincts screamed that something was wrong. He couldn't stay here any longer. He had to run. Just as he was about to flee, the man Brandon had seen on the bridge appeared, stepping out of a small boat nearby, his hood falling back to reveal tattoos covering his pale skin. At that moment, the man pointed in Brandon's direction, and in an instant, it was clear he had seen him. The world around him seemed to fade into darkness, and the man's demonic eyes appeared to pierce through his soul. The discomfort Brandon had felt earlier on the bridge turned into pure terror as the man began to move toward him quickly and menacingly. Brandon's instincts kicked in immediately. He forgot about the poor man being held as a sacrifice and started running. He could hear the man's breath behind him as he ran through the brush, branches whipping against his face. The twigs scratched at his arms as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Brandon was losing strength, and the distance to safety seemed endless. He finally emerged from the forest and onto the trail. The man and his cloak were still behind him, so he turned left toward the bridge. As there were no houses nearby and no one to call for help, the weight of exhaustion hit him, but there was no time to rest. He turned around and saw the man approaching, his face like a mask of rage. When he reached the middle of the suspension bridge, he stood there in disbelief and filled with fear. He looked at the wooden railing and read the mark that the cloaked man had written less than half an hour ago. It was barely legible, as it had been etched with a blade, but he was certain it read, Brandon McCain, August 7th, 1993, to October 20th, 2021. It was his name, along with his birth date. He realized that perhaps today would be a milestone in his life. And when he noticed the man approaching, holding a dagger, that could be the day he was about to die. The man swung the blade at him, and Brandon only had a few minutes to act. Brandon forgot all the legends, the depth, and the freezing temperatures, the river that could be a monster pulling him under. He didn't care. He lifted his right leg onto the railing, and as the man moved, Brandon dodged the blade that nearly pierced him. As the icy water splashed around him, his blood circulation became erratic. He only had enough time to look up and see the man on the bridge, still watching. But the freezing water dragged him down, and his body began to tremble as unbearable pain engulfed him. Brandon was nearly lost to disorientation, sinking slowly before closing his eyes, perhaps never to open them again.